Welcome to the Commission on Teacher Credentialing webinar on examining the literacy standard and TPEs for SB 488 certification. I'm Nancy Brimelson. I'm a former special consultant to the CTC and currently working part-time for the California Department of Education as statewide literacy co-director. I'm happy to share with you today some ideas and tips for a successful certification. We will divide this presentation into two parts. Part one, first things first. What do we need to know before we even begin this process? And what underlies all of this work related to literacy? And then focus on foundational skills. Part two of the presentation will be the role of meaning-making, language development, and effective expression, particularly as that relates to a comprehensive literature and language program. And then finally, assessment and intervention, including diagnostic techniques. But first things first. We need to be aware, and we're recommending that you take time to orient yourself to these key policies and grounding documents. It goes without saying that the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts and Literacy are critical. That's the basis for all of what we are teaching students in our schools and for this standard and set of TPEs. In addition, the California English Language Development Standards, equally important, particularly with the number of multilingual learners in this state. The English Language Arts English Language Development Framework for California Public Schools is really the grounding document that brings those two sets of standards together, providing the blueprint for how we are to teach those standards to all children. And finally, a document that was finalized after the framework was published in 2014, the California Dyslexia Guidelines. We'll begin with the standards for English language arts and literacy. As you're aware, they're divided into 4 domains of reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. Within reading, there are, and I misspoke, there's 4 strands of reading, writing, speaking and listening and language, and the 3 domains within reading of literature, informational text, and foundational skills. In addition, the California English Language Development Standards are organized into 3 parts: interacting in meaningful ways, collaborative, interpretive, and productive. Part 2, learning about how English works, structuring cohesive text, expanding and enriching ideas, and connecting and condensing ideas. And then Part 3, using foundational literacy skills and supporting students identified as English learners in acquiring those skills in English. The grounding document for all of this, for these 2 sets of standards, is the ELA-ELD framework for California Public Schools. It's a long document. I hesitate to tell you, but yes, it's more than 1,000 pages. But is a reference document, really divided into 3 important sections: the introduction in chapters 1 through 2, a good overview, and then specific chapters for grade levels. So chapter 3 is TK through grade 1, all the way to chapter 7, which are grades 9 through 12. And then our systems chapters. For example, chapter 8 is about assessment. This document, as I said before, is the blueprint for implementing both sets of standards. It's groundbreaking in the country to have a framework that actually addresses both sets of standards. No other state has done that. This is a figure that is in the framework repeatedly. We call it the circles of implementation, and it's a good illustration of the major goals of the framework, illustrated here in the outer circle in orange. The context in which learning is to take place, illustrated here in the white field. Important features: that instruction is motivating, engaging, integrated, respectful, and intellectually challenging. At the heart of this enterprise are the two sets of standards, and you can see cross-reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and language in all disciplines. We have ELA literacy and ELD standards. So what are these things called themes? Because those figure prominently in Literacy Standard 7 and the TPEs. We needed a way, and I was privileged to be part of the writing team for the framework, to bring together both sets of standards in an understandable way. And so these 5 themes of meaning making, effective expression, foundational skills, language development, and content knowledge were developed to be the organizing structure of the framework. Now, they don't all go in any hierarchical order. They're all critically important, as I'm illustrating with this animation. Simply said, meaning making is understanding what we are reading, what we're writing, how we make meaning as we speak and present. Effective expression is to communicate effectively, but to also analyze communications, what we read and what we hear from others, for features of effective expression. So writing, speaking, presenting, all fit here, as well as discussion. Language development. All students need to develop their language across vocabulary, grammatical structures, and discourse. Content knowledge. We learn to read, write, speak, listen, and use language in order to learn content. And so the connection there is critical. And foundational skills, last but certainly not least, and critically important to this certification process, those skills that enable students to do all of the rest, and that is to decode and encode, to be able to read and write and engage with a full curriculum. With that in mind, we turn then to the last of these grounding documents, which are the California Dyslexia Guidelines, organized into several chapters: overview and characteristics of dyslexia in the first 4 chapters, other factors related to dyslexia, including special education, screening, assessment, and instruction, or teaching students with dyslexia, in chapters 9 through 11, and then other resources. More about this document when we discuss the 3rd table that you'll be doing as a part of certification. That takes us to our focus on foundational skills. We're going to look at the narrative response that you're required to provide in 3.2, as well as the table for 3.1. So beginning with that narrative response to the full standard 7A. So in the standard, you, beyond the first couple of pages, which provide the overview of the entire approach to literacy, we have the specific foundational skills. And I'd like to walk through the different paragraphs of that standard to make clear what we mean by each of these and how they work together. So the first paragraph really is about the components and features of the foundational skills that are addressed in this standard, this program standard for what it is that teacher preparation programs need to do to ensure that their candidates are prepared. It includes print concepts that aligns neatly with the standards that we, not to be confused with program standards, the K-12 standards for students, including the alphabet. So in addition to book handling and all the usual things we think of in print concepts, moving to phonological awareness, including, importantly, phonemic awareness, the ability to perceive individual sounds and to manipulate those, is critical to students being able to learn to decode and apply those skills in phonics, spelling, and word recognition, the third major topic here. And we pull together phonics and word recognition and add spelling to that because they really go together. So as students are learning that particular letters make and in combination make sounds, then they also learn to write those, moving into decoding and encoding. So decoding, learning to decode what the sounds mean into meaningful words, and encoding those same sounds, mapping those onto the letters, and word recognition, because there's a full range of what we need to do as we learn to sight words, some words that are temporarily sight words, and some that are irregular words where certain patterns do need to be learned by students. Moving into morphological awareness. That's critical and an important piece. We borrow that from the language standards because of the importance of prefixes and suffixes and roots and base words in understanding what the meanings of words are and these chunks that are helpful in the decoding process, in developing automaticity. Eventually, we move to text reading fluency, where students are able to read with sufficient rate and sufficient automaticity, accuracy, and prosody, which simply means, as you're well aware, of intonation or the ability to indicate through phrasing that how it would be in speech, and it's a window into comprehension. And then finally, the features that all of these things are structured, organized, taught in a sequence, directly, systematically, and explicitly. Moving on to paragraph 2. And I won't spend as much time going through each of these, but you see here, we're looking at the connections within and across the strands of reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and the domains within foundational skills, literature, and informational text. Phonemic awareness, in addition to sound symbol correspondences, spelling patterns, and practice in decodable text. So students not only learn these, but also have an opportunity to practice those in texts that include the patterns that students have learned. Decodable text is used for a limited period of time for a particular purpose, and it by no means precludes the kind of work that students need to do in meaning making and will do at the youngest ages, kindergarten and first grade, through read alouds and other experiences. But in this case, it has a very specific place and specific use as a part of the learning cycle for phonics and word recognition, including phonemic awareness. Text reading fluency also combines with spelling and syllable patterns, semantics, morphology, and syntax, All of those go together in terms of a student understanding what the words mean, the semantics, how sentences are put together in sensible ways, syntax, and the morphology that helps them so they know when they see pre as before a word that means before, all of which supports accuracy and it supports fluency, which remembering that that's a range of prosody, accuracy, and rate, not just a focus on rate. The paragraph goes on to talk about the connections among foundational skills, language, and cognitive skills the students are going to need as they advance into reading increasingly complex texts and writing increasingly complex texts. So as they progress through the grades, what they're doing in the way of foundational skills becomes increasingly complex. A focus here on decoding being mapping spellings to pronunciation at the earliest levels, and encoding mapping phonemes to spellings at the earliest levels. Of course, as children progress through kindergarten and first grade, decoding and encoding become much more complex as they deal with larger orthographic patterns and larger chunks of text. And finally, a note about teaching children to form their letters specifically, how to print, and that the fluency that a child has in terms of their ability to use print quickly and effortlessly. All of this is to move children to automaticity so that they can use all of their cognitive energies to comprehend text and to create new texts. Moving on then to the next paragraphs in this standard, as you are creating this narrative that really describes how you address all of these pieces within your comprehensive program. Paragraph 3 addresses multilingual learners. The simultaneous development of foundational skills and oral English proficiency for some students, unless they are in a dual language program, in which case they may be developing literacy skills in their home language or an additional language first, or in a 50-50 program, they may be doing both of doing foundational skills in both languages during those parts of instruction, and the importance of cross-linguistic transfer. And as you know, there is a paragraph dedicated to ELD later on in Standard 7. But within the foundational skills standard, attention to the needs of multilingual learners is called out in paragraph 3. Paragraph 4 addresses early intervention, including diagnostic techniques that are informed, that do inform that intervention within an MTSS framework, which, as you're aware, moves along a continuum of universal support for children, our core instruction, our base instruction, supplemental support for children who may be not progressing as expected and who need additional teaching time and support in order to learn concepts, all the way to intensified support or intensive intervention, as we have known as tiers 1, 2, and 3. This paragraph also addresses the need for progress monitoring and this range of support, as I've just described, for students not progressing as expected. Collaboration with families and guardians, as well as other professionals, as we're supporting these students. And the structure for providing that supplemental support and making referrals for intensified support and intensive intervention. Brand new teachers are not expected to be providing what we might think of as tier 3 intervention, but to understand when that intervention may be needed, when the supplemental support they've been providing, along with the help of other professionals, hasn't been enough. And then finally, clinical practice in paragraph 6, that every candidate needs supervised, guided practice in the foundational skills at the initial or supplemental levels of the foundational skills or the beginning levels of reading. Now, we didn't forget paragraph 5. That relates to single subject credentials, and those credentials are not subject to certification. Taken together, your narrative for 3.2 needs to communicate how all of this works together across the courses and field experiences that you have for candidates to obtain this knowledge and the skills to implement these capacities. So what are resources? There are a number of resources to support you in this work. One of the key resources is the English Language Arts English Language Development Framework. All of these are hot linked for you. You have access to these slides so that you can go directly to the document. Chapters 3 through 5 really focus the most on the foundational skills. Those are the chapters for transitional kindergarten through grade 1, then grades 2 and 3, and grades 4 and 5. So the foundational skills sections of those chapters, both the overview, each of those chapters has an overview for the grade span, and then there is a separate section for each grade, along with snapshots of practice, brief glimpses, figures highlighting practices, bulleted lists, and vignettes that show how all of this comes together in units of study for students, both including integrated and designated ELD. For foundational skills, there was a document created called the Resource Guide to the Foundational Skills that brings together the advice that is included in chapters 3 through 5 and also in some other chapters into one document, and that is linked for you here. More about that momentarily. And recently, the CDE, and since that's my current role, I participated in a webinar series, a 9-part webinar series on the ELA framework called Recentering the ELA-ELD Framework. The second session was on foundational skills, and there is a posted webinar recording, which is coming soon, the presentation slides, and foundational skills guidance, which I'll show you a screenshot of shortly. And then a little known document, the California Digital Learning Integration and Standards Guidance, also provides more resources related to the foundational skills. More on that in a moment. Circling back to each of these CDE resources, here you see the resource guide to the foundational skills that was developed as a separate document. It's about 12, 13 pages altogether. No, actually, it must be at least 17 pages. It's probably 20 pages altogether, in addressing each of the areas of the foundational skills. You see it listed here: print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition, fluency. Describing how they come together and how other standards from other strands figure in. On the screen, you see the first page of the document with an overview, and then a chart that you'll find on pages 16 and 17, figure 5, where selected critical instructional foci in foundational and closely related skills by grade level. This is a nice list of what it is that children really need to be learning at each of these grades in this area, and would be helpful as something to share with candidates and something to look to in terms of assessing their knowledge of this area. These are some screenshots of the specific guidance documents that are provided for each of the 9 webinars that CDE conducted. This is the guidance document, just some selected pages from the foundational skills webinar that list the specific chapters and page numbers where you will find information on foundational skills within each of the chapters, with the links to the specific chapters. You'll see that in this second screenshot here that you also have other topics, other chapters, assessment, access, and equity, and then other resources such as the resource guide to the foundational skills that we just looked at in the previous slide. In addition, there are figures listed on page 4 of this guidance document that are really nice as sort of benchmarks for your candidates in terms of, a list of English phonemes, phonics and word recognition terminology, and a number of other figures such as English syllable types, etc., that are good reference points for your candidates and for you. And as I said, this little known document, the Digital Learning Integration and Standards Guidance, was developed during the pandemic as a way to highlight the key standards for ELA literacy and related standards and instructional considerations. This lengthy document is divided into 3 sections. This is from section C, which is all about ELA literacy and ELD. This is an excerpt from grade 1, chapter 12, and it is organized. You won't be surprised to hear that it is organized in a similar fashion to the framework by the themes. This is the section, these 4 pages on foundational skills. So beginning on the bottom of page 321, you'll see a standard for grade 1, and then the key considerations for teaching that standard. I would suggest you look to this for opportunities for practice for your candidates, or perhaps opportunities to assess, and certainly for content to introduce. But it is a nice, quick way of gaining an overview of how these fit together. Now, these highlighted sections in yellow and in purple here indicate standards that cut across multiple themes. The purple are all for writing. The yellow are all related to foundational skills. And this is the tag end of the standard before. The pink have to do with speaking and listening. And so this is another opportunity to see how ELA literacy and ELD are integrated, and how the themes are integrated across instruction in language arts. CTC also has a resource that is posted on the literacy and reading webpage that, if you don't know it by now, I imagine you will soon. This document is posted on that website as well as all the instructions for SB 488 certification. This particular document, the resource guide on preparing teachers for effective literacy instruction, addresses foundational skills on pages 15 through 29. And yes, when I worked for CTC, I had a hand in developing this document, which was created based on all the things that students need to learn um, along their way from kindergarten through grade 12. So the items listed here, this particular example is for fluency, and it's organized first by broad content, are taken from the expectations for what students by grade level need to learn. So you will see uh, not only page numbers, but also in many cases, grade designations when students are expected to have mastered these things. Also, the framework, the dyslexia guidelines, and many other documents went into creating the document across all themes. Moving along then, with all of those resources in hand, you should be well prepared to complete the narrative and turn your attention to the table 3.1 for foundational skills. My personal recommendation is that you do the narrative first and the big picture, then move to this specific table. And then when you finish this, maybe move back to your narrative to see if there's anything else you need to add. The table 3.1 is divided into 9 rows that echo what we just went over with regard to the standard. But specifically, you'll be called on to address where each of these concepts are introduced in your program and how they're introduced, where they are practiced, where candidates practice them, and then how candidates are assessed in each concept. So, print concepts, including letters of the alphabet, phonological awareness, including phonemic awareness, phonics, spelling, and word recognition, including all of these letter sounds, spelling sounds, sound symbol correspondences, of course, all roughly the same thing. Decoding and encoding, which we spent a bit of time on talking about, including morphological awareness, word parts, etc., and how it is that students really are not only learning to decode the words that they see in print, but they're learning to encode those words and to write them and to spell them. And eventually, as they move into advanced decoding and word recognition and advanced writing, how all of this moves along a continuum. Text reading fluency, including, as we discussed, accuracy, including automaticity, prosody, or intonation, and rate. So where is that within your program? And then moving on to F, or really the feature as I described it from paragraph 1 of instruction in foundational skills, that it is intended to be structured, organized, if you will, a sequence. There are several sequences depending on materials that you're using, but that are taught directly, systematically, and explicitly, and where students have the opportunity to practice that in connected decodable text, which we discussed a bit in connection with paragraph 2. A little note here, when you are looking at these individual rows within table 3.1, if you are wondering the context in which these occur, I would recommend that you go back to the full text of the standard, read through the paragraph that discusses decodable text, and then if that still is unclear, go to the foundational skills resource guide that accompanies the framework, moving back to get a full picture so that when you complete your introduce, practice, and assess chart in table 3.1, you have a clear picture of how this all works together. And H, providing instruction in text reading fluency that emphasizes spelling and syllable patterns, semantics, morphology, and syntax as a piece of what goes to making a student fluent. So all these things working together to help a student read accurately and fluently, or with sufficient rate and with sufficient expression. And then finally, I, which is really moving into that more advanced level of foundational skills and how the foundational skills, language, and cognitive skills all come together to support students as they read and write increasingly complex disciplinary texts with comprehension and effective expression. That is always our goal. Meaning is always our goal, and language is always woven into the instruction that we give across foundational skills. So let's look for a moment at what we mean by introduce, practice, and assess, which you are familiar with in terms of your preparation for accreditation. But just some examples here under introduce. It could be a text reading. It could be multiple text readings. It could be a lecture or multimedia presentation that a faculty member presents. It could be a video, a longer video, a shorter video clip, or interspersed, or a combination of readings, lectures, and video demonstrations. It could be an instructor think aloud after watching a video or while watching a video, stopping to comment on what is taking place. And always remembering that we introduce, but we may not be finished, because as we provide more content to our candidates, we will circle back and layer on more nuanced understandings of concepts as we progress. How do candidates then practice this? Examples: they could create a lesson in response to a case study scenario in class or independently. They could, there could be the development of lessons that they would actually implement in their field placement, or an in-class simulation that candidates do individually or together. In-class discussion, analysis of video or case studies, and identification of next steps. We want to not only look at each of these individual concepts within foundational skills, but how they connect with other concepts. And if a student, let's say a first grade student, is evidencing a particular understanding or perhaps a misunderstanding, what that means in terms of next steps or going back to previous steps. So a fuller understanding of how it fits together and sequence. And of course, an assigned paper. So all of these are just some ideas about some examples for practice. And then assess. You might be assessing a presentation that a candidate makes in class. Maybe in combination with a paper that is written to support the presentation, an observation of a lesson in a field placement with a checklist that perhaps you in your program have developed for either the supervisor or the cooperating teacher to use in observing that lesson. Of course, an exam or quiz, a paper, or grading of an assignment. There are many ways to assess a candidate, but we're looking at how All of these things are introduced, practiced, and assessed individually across all 9 of these areas within the foundational skills. And an example that was shared with me that a colleague of mine has used to teach letter formation or just beginning printing for very young children. This is something that didn't take a lot of time, but candidates watch a video of how to form letters and how to teach children to form letters. And then with special paper, they themselves practice making those letters and then upload that for their instructor to see, who can then assess whether or not the candidate is able to form the letters using the pattern that's been presented, because how we model for children is critically important. So that's just a really small example of something introduced, practiced, and assessed. And it doesn't take much time. It's an isolated piece, but it is an illustration, if you will. So what are some considerations? Well, when you are completing this table, you need to attend to grain size. So this probably goes without saying, but what you present, either through links to specific places in your syllabus, to specific assignments, to readings, etc., need to be specific enough to address each concept, all 9 of those concepts in table 3.1. It also, though, needs to add up. In other words, it needs to be comprehensive and sufficient. So taken together, the I, P, and A examples provide a complete picture. It's clear how the relationship of the concepts are to one another, how the pieces fit together, how they're structured and organized with an adequate amount of time so away with a complete picture of what the foundational skills are, how they can be taught, and with demonstrations of that understanding and the ability to use. There are opportunities, clear opportunities in in particular with practice, for the candidate to see, experience, and practice how concepts are taught explicitly, directly, and systematically. That is critically important for the foundational skills, since that is a feature that is required, but is critical in terms of the candidate really having an idea of what it looks like in real life, what it feels like when they're doing it, and how they can accomplish it. And then finally, just another tip, using the language of the standard and the TPEs, using the same terminology that is included in the standard in your explanations in the table 3.1 and in all of your tables where you indicate where something is introduced, practiced, and assessed. It will help the reviewer understand where you're pointing and what you mean, with, of course, an illustration via your syllabus, your assignments, and all your other examples for how those things take place. Hope that this has been a good overview of what you need to do for SB 488 certification with regard to foundational skills. Stay tuned for part 2, when we'll look at the role of meaning making, language development, and effective expression, as well as assessment and intervention for tables 4.1 and 4.5. 4.5.1. Thank you.